And we're recording. My name is Alex Kotlikoff. I'm very pleased to be here with my father, Larry Kotlikoff, and Torston and Flemming. And today we're going to be, this is our first episode of Economics Matters, the podcast. And today we'll be talking about whether or not we are entering into a recession.
And I'm Larry Kotlikoff, as Alex just indicated. His dad. We're delighted to have you listening to and watching this podcast. We're going to focus on whether or not the U.S. economy and the world economy really is going to be heading into a recession, as many people are now predicting, and whether or not that's going to be a real event or a psychological event, in the sense that we talk ourselves into that outcome. And let me just begin by introducing Torston, and who's going to introduce his son, Flemming. This is a father-son event today. It's going to be fun. And so Torston is the chief economist for Apollo Global Management. Torston, I'm going to let you describe Apollo Global Management, but from my understanding, it's one of the coolest investment companies in the world. Maybe not the biggest, but very, very cutting edge. Torston has a really remarkable experience. First of all, he's an economist, PhD from the University of Copenhagen, and has also been at Princeton University prior to joining Apollo, where he's the chief economist his formal title is chief economist of macroeconomics and market analysis, and he worked before joining Apollo for 15 years as the chief economist at Deutsche Bank. That's not a minor matter, becoming chief economist for Deutsche Bank. His team was ranked in the annual Institutional Investor Survey for a decade. It was top ranked for a decade, and then it was ranked number one in 2019. So he has a terrific track record at Deutsche Bank before recently joining in 2020 Apollo as their chief economist. And then prior to joining Deutsche Bank, Torston had a long career at both the IMF and the OECD. I guess you started out at the OECD in Paris and then worked at the IMF in Washington. So having that background with these major international institutions, working with them and then working with Deutsche Bank and now with Apollo, that's an incredible insight into the world economy and to different economic problems of specific economies. My background, just to mention, before I turn it over, I also want to mention a few words about Alex, but my background is I'm an economist at Boston University, as many of you watching this and listening know, and you can learn more about me at kotlikoff.net. I've been around for a bit and write a fair amount. I have a newsletter at larrykotlikoff.substack.com, and I write a lot of columns for different outlets, and have a software company which Alex is a principal at, and works with me. And the company's one of our products website is called maxify.com. So anybody interested in financial planning software that does economics-based planning, please check out maxify.com. And Alex does all kinds of marketing and video making and different kinds of jobs for the company. And today I asked him to join us as well as Flemming as a kibitzer on this discussion about the future of the U.S. economy and some other factors, about inflation, what's happening there, and interest rates. So let's turn this over to Torston to maybe tell us a little bit about Apollo and also about Flemming, and then we'll talk give a little background to this podcast. Again, and this is the first podcast of my Substack newsletter, if you like, which is called Economics Matters, and this is Economics Matters, the podcast. So, Torston, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Larry. And it's great to be here. I look much forward to the discussion. Yeah, so as you just mentioned, I work with Apollo Global Management, which has about $500 billion under management. And Apollo does alternative asset management. And alternative asset management is essentially everything that's not publicly listed on, say, the stock exchange or in corporate bond markets. And my job consists of discussing internally, externally about are we entering a recession? Is inflation a problem? Why did inflation go up? What are the chances inflation will be coming down? And I'm very delighted that my son Flemming is also joining us. Flemming is a student at American University, just finished freshman year in economics. So I look forward to the discussion here.
Terrific. Well, okay, so let me back us up a little bit about the question here, which is, are we talking ourselves into a recession yet again? So if you go to Kotlikoff.net, you'll see an article. If you go to the Kotlikoff.net and then you go to articles and you type in the word CON, you'll find an article called The Big Con, which is I wrote for the Milken Review, which is an easy read. It's about the Great Recession. And if you look at the alleged causes of the Great Recession that were alleged by the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which was set up right after the Great Recession ended, they said that the causes were very clear: fraudulent subprime loans, a massive housing price bubble, crooked rating companies, exorbitant bank leverage, complex derivatives, regulatory capture. That means the regulators were captured by Wall Street and did whatever Wall Street said they wanted them to do. Bankers with no skin in the game, Fed screwing up their interest rate policy, and some other reasons. But if you actually look, as I do in this article, at the evidence, at the facts, you find that none of the suspects can be convicted based on the facts. In other words, really checking carefully, you find that none of the things that the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission allege is actually true, that none of these factors could have possibly caused the Great Recession. And indeed, most of the things they said about these factors was absolutely 100% wrong. To begin with, subprimes were far too small to matter, and their problems were vastly overstated. If you look at the worst of the worst subprimes, particularly the ones the Federal Reserve bought when Bear Stearns was sold to J.P. Morgan, the Fed had to take the worst subprimes of J.P. Morgan of Bear Stearns off of J.P. Morgan's back in getting J.P. Morgan to agree. They were called the Maiden Lane assets. Maiden Lane, by the way, is at the rear end of the Federal Reserve. So there's like a small little joke there, inside joke, I believe, about the name of this group of securities that were viewed as complete crap. And several years later, when they sold those securities after the Great Recession was over, they actually ended up making money. So here you have the worst of the worst subprimes go through what was called a Great Recession, and they actually did okay. So there was a great overstatement about the problems with those subprimes, but those subprimes themselves were just too small relative to the mortgage market, which itself was too small relative to the financial market to really bring down the economy in any meaningful way. House prices were not crazy high if you look at the data. Rating companies, it turns out, people have studied this carefully, did their job quite well. Banks weren't unusually leveraged, particularly Lehman and Bear Stearns. They were less leveraged than they had been in the past. There were some banks that were leveraged, more leveraged, like Goldman Sachs, but from what I understand, but they did not get into trouble. The market didn't misunderstand, as in mispriced derivatives. Regulators turned out to have done their job, and bankers had plenty of exposed skin, and they got badly burnt. And then the Fed, there's no evidence that they did what they did was too little to really matter. So if you really look at this article, The Big Con, you find out that the causes of the Great Recession were not what has been alleged to be the causes. Now, what then was the cause? Well, in my view, it was just panic. That if you have everybody talking about things that weren't true and getting themselves scared, you immediately scare not, well, Wall Street got itself scared, but then you start scaring the private sector. And that leads to companies saying, well, gee, if everybody's talking about a recession, and they're even calling it the Great Recession, and they're making comparisons with the Great Depression, and it's in every newspaper and every media outlet, and we have politicians like, talking about it nonstop, then maybe I better start firing people, because at the end of the month, if I don't get customers, I have to pay these people. So the biggest liability I face is my payroll. So let me fire my employees, or some, at least a chunk of them, because that will give me some protection against customers not showing up. But of course, my employees are somebody else's customers. So I'm firing somebody else's customers on the supposition that they're firing my customers, and they're firing my customers on the supposition that I'm firing their customers. So that's what you have, this a set of beliefs that can be self-fulfilling. Self-fulfilling prophecy is the phrase that that Robert Merton, Bob Merton's, I think Robert Merton Sr. came up with. He's a sociologist at Columbia University. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Anyway, we have a history of economic analysis of what are called multiple equilibria. We write down models in economics of macroeconomies doing well and also getting into trouble. And a lot of our models have a feature where the equations, and that's what an economic model is about, it's a set of mathematical equations, those models have more than one solution. Just like if you think about x squared equals 4, that's an equation with two solutions, x equals 2 and x equals minus 2. Both, if you square x, if you square 2, you get to 4. If you square minus 2, you get to 4. So that's the sense in which equations or sets of equations can have multiple solutions. And our models have that. And indeed, the classic model of bank runs by two economists called Diamond and Didvik that model. The Diamond-Didvik model has at its core a multiple equilibria where you can have a bank run happening as one outcome, or a bank run not happening as another outcome. And the key thing here is that these runs can happen, these runs can happen at the drop of a dime. They can happen if everybody's expectations, beliefs change, and there's nothing in the model to pin down those beliefs. And the same thing for recessions as well. So I just want to say one other thing before we kind of talk about the actual facts of where things are today. If you look at past recessions and in the U.S., you have the names of those recessions telling you, in effect, about multiple equilibria. They're also called coordination failures by economists. You have the credit crisis of 1772. A crisis is something that happens kind of quickly. And when the economy is flipping from one position to another, that is suggestive of multiple equilibria. Panic of 1873. The word panic suggests, going from being calm to being nuts. That's also suggestive of multiple equilibria. You got the panic of 1873. You got the panic of 1893. You got the panic of 1907. You got the Asian crisis of 1997. You've got the Great Depression, which of course was kicked off by a panic in the stock market. You've got the Great Recession, which I just tried to explain did not arise from anything fundamental, from what I can tell, from what the facts suggest, but rather from a panic. And then if you look at one last thing here, that I find quite interesting. If you look at what actually led the economy from one day to the next to flip, in 1893, we had a financial panic in the U.S., a recession in the U.S., kicked off by a failed coup in Argentina. Okay. In 1909, there was a failure to corner the copper market. In 1929, right before the crash in 29, a guy named Roger Babson, who was a famous forecaster, he announced that a crash was coming. And apparently he excited everybody in that direction. And sure enough, the stock market, we had like black, whatever it was, Tuesday, and the market fell and it fell some more and it kept falling. In 1837, there was a decline in the price of cotton in the UK globally. 1772, there was a guy in a British banking house named Alexander Fordyce who was rather rich. He was a partner in this banking group, and he went bankrupt personally, and he fled to France, and that was enough to cause major concern about the future of the economy, the financial system, and to lead to a recession. There was a run on the Thai currency in 1998. That led to a panic in 13 Asian countries, the Asian financial crisis. And in 2008, just to kick off the Great Recession, where did that kick off? It kicked off when two small Bear Stearns subsidiaries failed. They were invested in subprimes. And that was enough for everybody to decide that subprimes were horrific and that they were ubiquitous and that they were enough to bring down the economy, which absolutely wasn't true. Anyway, I'm going to stop here, and then we're going to turn over to Torston to tell us about the facts of the real economy and also, where you see things going with inflation and interest rates.
Yeah, so, and as you're saying, Larry, I mean, at the moment, which is, of course, the backdrop for our conversation, there's a lot of talk about a recession coming. The challenge is that we may or may not get a recession, but if we look at the facts, at least where we stand today, there are just not any signs that we are in a recession today. I do know, as you just highlighted, that GDP growth was negative in the first quarter, and also now the Atlanta Fed GDP now estimate for the second quarter is actually also negative. So technically, we could have a recession in the first half of this year, but it will be a highly unusual recession because we just got last Friday the employment report with the unemployment rate near the lowest level in 50 years, namely 3.6%. Remember in February of 2020, the unemployment rate before the pandemic was 3.5%. So if the unemployment rate today is 3.6 and the low before the pandemic was 3.5, that's essentially the same level in round numbers. And that's again telling us that at least right now, this definitely is not a recession. So it is a good question you're asking. Why is it that everyone is talking about a recession? Where are these fears coming from? Because if you look at the hard data that has been coming in, it's just really difficult to see any evidence of a recession at the moment. For example, if you look at the TSA data for how many people fly around the country, think of this as how many people yesterday showed their boarding pass to a TSA agent. That data has continued to go up. There's now more than 2 million people who fly around the country in the US, meaning show their boarding pass to a TSA agent. And that's essentially the same level as we were at before the pandemic. So that has normalized completely after the pandemic, and that's not been slowing down. So first of all, consumer services, or in this case, airline traffic, and how many people fly in airplanes is actually still very strong. If you look at the daily data from OpenTable for how many people eat at restaurants, is also back to pre-pandemic levels and has also been very, very strong. So it is also not the case that there are fewer people going out to eat for dinner, fewer people going out traveling, and fewer people therefore generally moving around. More broadly, if you look at the Google and Apple mobility data for how many people are going to restaurants, to malls, to parks, is also normal at very high levels, meaning normal, meaning at pre-pandemic levels. So in many ways, we've gone through the pandemic and we have now normalized in so many ways on so many indicators that there is just not much sign at really any high frequency or low frequency indicator that things are slowing down. And finally, perhaps most importantly, if we look at the jobs report that just came out for the month of June, the US economy created 372,000 jobs. Wage growth was 5%. And all that again also points to the economy still being strong. And I could list a long list of other indicators that again also confirm the same picture. So to your very important introductory discussion of multiple equilibria, why is it that people are talking about this other equilibrium of going down into a recession when up to this point there are just actually no signs of a recession at the moment, at least in the incoming data?
Yeah. And how do you see, well, let me ask Alex and Flemming, if you have any comments about any of this. Oops, sorry, I think my light in the room went off. You guys take it over for a second. Hang on a second.
We'll let him turn the light back on there.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Yeah, this is an energy conscious building. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I was going to ask, I mean, there's also been talk of inflation, obviously, for the past year or 2 years now. And I mean, what relationship do you guys feel between the rate of inflation and the future of inflation and the possibility of a recession? Do we have a situation where firms are not investing because of the high rate of inflation? I don't necessarily see that right now, but I know that's been a fear amongst economists.
I mean, at least from the incoming data, as we just talked about, if the data is very strong, and exactly as you're saying, Alex, that has now come with inflation at very high levels, then of course what is very important in this context is that the Federal Reserve is trying to get inflation down. Let's not forget that the latest inflation data is that inflation is at the moment 8.6%. And the Federal Reserve has an inflation target, meaning a goal that inflation should be 2. So in very plain English, if inflation is almost 9, and the goal is that inflation should be 2, then it's not a surprise that the Federal Reserve is aggressively trying to cool the economy down. And the main tool they have to do this is to raise interest rates. So the important backdrop for your question is that the reason why people are so worried about a recession coming is because there is this fear that the Federal Reserve will have to raise interest rates very, very quickly from very low levels so that we can get inflation down from, in round numbers, around 8-9% to 2%. And the fear that, to Larry's introduction again here, is that you can have is that, well, maybe the Fed could pull this off and get inflation down from 9 to 2 without a recession. But if all analysts, if all the Wall Street economists, and if all the observers around the table end up saying, the wolf is coming, we'll have a recession because that's the only way we can get inflation down from 9 to 2, well, that could increase the likelihood that we may go down the wrong equilibrium and may actually end up having a recession, even if there could be other scenarios where the Fed could slowly raise interest rates, or maybe a little bit faster because that's maybe needed, but basically gradually begin to cool the economy down and therefore gradually get inflation back towards 2%. And the problem today is that we have simply not seen that roll lower in inflation yet. Inflation continues to go up, and we actually get new data for that this coming week on Wednesday, where the consensus expects inflation to go up from the current 8.6 to 8.8. So we may have to wait a little bit more in financial markets, and particularly the stock market and in credit markets, before we get that evidence that inflation is coming down. And that's why there's so much sense of panic, as Larry mentioned in the beginning, that there's so much uncertainty about the two main questions at the moment. When will inflation begin to come down? And will it come down to too quickly or slowly? And the second question is, do we need to have a hard landing to get inflation down? Or could we do this just with a soft landing? And all this the dust is really whirled up at the moment. And the toolbox for the economist is very messy, finding the right ways of getting inflation to come down. But once in the next several quarters we get some answers to this, then we will, of course, have an idea. Will inflation come down in a gradual way? And will it be associated with a hard landing or a soft landing? And in the meantime, the narrative that's being told in financial markets, the narrative that's been told on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times or the New York Times turns out to be really, really important, because as both of you just mentioned, maybe companies will begin to hold back with the capex spending, and maybe consumers will hold back with consumption. So it's a very fragile environment we're in, where it's very important what is the story, what is the narrative that's being told about where we're going.
And I guess the follow-up question is that there's also competing narratives about what is causing inflation, what has caused inflation since the pandemic. You hear from some economists like Larry Summers, for example. It says that there's too much demand, and probably it's a factor of the employment rate being so low. There's other economists like Dean Baker, for example, who and I guess probably Paul Krugman, I assume, who've talked about really this being an issue of supply chains being disrupted. And we do still have this pandemic with multiple variants coming out. It seems every couple months in China. State policy there has been much more draconian in terms of the way they deal with COVID, and that's certainly having an effect on supply chains and production overseas. So I guess, even if the Fed does raise interest rates, if it is a matter of a supply chain issue, and I'm not saying it is, what effect will that even have on inflation?
Let me jump in on that a little bit. So I think the Fed is just a kind of engaged in cosmetic surgery here, not even surgery, just a cosmetic game here, because they haven't really raised interest rates enough to matter. The 8.6% figure that Torston was referencing is inflation, I guess, in May going back to the prior May. So it's really a retrospective figure, and it may come in a little bit higher retrospectively. But if you look prospectively, there's data suggesting that, I think from Torston actually, that he has a terrific newsletter that he sends out. People should sign up. Maybe you want to say how to do that. Maybe you want to do a little ad right now if you're making that available to the public. I don't know if you do that.
No. Well, if you are interested, you can let me know. Normally, it's for clients of Apollo.
Oh, okay.
All right.
Well, then I'll just
if you are a financial advisor, if you are in any way someone who could be a customer of Apollo, please just reach out to me or your Apollo sales contact.
Yep. So, but what I've been seeing coming over the email from Torston is that rents are starting to come down. Oil prices are coming down. Wheat prices are coming down. Commodity prices in general are coming down. Housing prices, I think, are going up at a slower rate. I think the Cleveland Fed is predicting that monthly, so not inflation over the last year, but inflation this month versus the month we're now in. Last month in June versus the month we're now in July. That the Cleveland Fed is predicting inflation in July to be about half the rate that was experienced in June, or if I have that right. So there are some different indicators suggesting that we might be over the peak. I personally think that it is more supply side, plus a lot of pent-up demand. But, as Torston was indicating, we have had, now people have had the opportunity to spend a lot of money in restaurants and take trips for several months. So that might also be coming to an end. I don't think the Feds, even if they raise rates 0.75 of a percentage point the next time around, which is what they're saying they're going to do, we're still going to have be in a context where if inflation stays around 8%, 8-9%, we're still talking about negative interest rates. Mortgage rates have also come down of late in the last week or so. They're below 6%. I think maybe around 5 something. I don't know what the latest 30-year number, but if we're talking about an 8% inflation rate, if it was really 8%, and you can borrow at 5%, you're paying negative interest. If you know, so uh, so the and then if you look at the inflation indexed bond yields, which are the real interest. So when I say negative interest, we're paying negative interest in real terms after inflation. So short-term real interest rates, as revealed by inflation index bonds, which are called TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, those yields in the short run over the next year are quite low. They're negative as far as I know from looking. And then if you look out 5 years, they're quite low. It's about maybe probably less than 1%. I think the 30-year tip is yielding around 0.8% the last time I looked. So we're really still in a very low real interest rate environment. The idea that interest rates are high and therefore that's going to slow the economy when real interest rates are actually low, negative in the short term, and low in terms of long-term and rates by historic standards, that also just doesn't connect to anything that's actually, you know, sensible to be arguing that the economy is going to go in recession because nominal interest rates are going up while real interest rates are either going down or staying low. Just doesn't make sense. Anyway, Flemming, kick in here a little bit. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, just echoing Dad's points from earlier, and there's all this talk about not recession. Well, of course, recession, that is what we're all here for. But inflation numbers releasing this Wednesday, the consensus is that not this month, but this quarter at least will be peaking with inflation, and that it should be a downhill path from here because of all the rate hikes upcoming. But I'm also curious, that's of course from a monetary point of view. I'd be kind of curious to hear about thoughts on fiscal policy that could be applied here.
Well, one thing we know about fiscal policy is that when the government when we have inflation, the private sector gets hurt. And so if you think about everybody who had checking accounts or is on a fixed pension, Detroit firemen, for example, who settled in that, when Detroit went bankrupt, they were given, I think, 40 cents on the dollar in the form of a pension reduction. But then that pension is fixed in nominal terms. So now you have 8% inflation. They've lost 8% of their lifetime pension in terms of real purchasing power. That's horrific. People who kept their money in cash because they were worried the stock market was so high, they just saw an 8-9% reduction in the real value. Now that loss to the private sector, given the economy is at full employment and is likely to stay there through time if we don't scare ourselves to death, that means that the government is making money by making money, in effect. This is what economists call seigniorage. When the government, through time, is printing money, which we are doing out of thin air, prices go up. The government, prints, think about the government just printing money this afternoon to buy chicken for President Biden's lunch. So the private sector gets the money, Biden gets his chicken. Now there's more dollars chasing a smaller number of goods, and the prices go up. And that means that the money we had initially in our checking accounts, savings accounts, in bonds that we were holding, all those nominal assets go down in real terms. And given the economy is kind of a closed zero-sum game through time, if the private sector is made worse off, given the amount of output, the government sector is implicitly being made better off. So this is a good thing. Inflation, even if Senator Manchin thinks inflation is a bad thing for somehow fiscal, the government has been printing so much money and causing inflation, and therefore this has been kind of fiscally irresponsible. he should think again, because this is the West Virginian senator who I think is kind of thinking about inflation and fiscal issues a little bit backwards, because inflation is actually a good thing on the fiscal side, but of course that's a bit of a drag in terms of consumer spending. And there are some signs. Again, I'm hearing from Torston that consumer sentiment, we know consumer confidence is down by a whole lot. And we know that also there's some surveys suggesting that consumers are feeling pinched. And we know that real wages have dropped by about 3%, 2.5%, according to the BLS over the last year. I just saw that number today. So that wages are rising, but they're not keeping up. Maybe they will overshoot the price increases over the rest of the year, and workers will get back to where they are. That itself could be a cause of recession, where workers' real wages decline and their spending then declines, and that does have potentially a real impact on firms' demand and therefore their supply, and they start laying off people because they don't see as much demand. But so that's a long-winded response. But let me make it even more longer-winded, which is that our tax system is not inflation indexed. So, for example, Social Security benefits are subject to federal income taxation. As inflation goes up, more and more people find that their Social Security benefits are subject to up to 85% taxation. First 50% and then 85% of your Social Security benefits are subject to taxation once you pass these two thresholds in the tax law, which were purposefully not indexed to inflation going back to 1983 when they were sent into law. The Medicare Part B premium that elderly people who pay premiums for Medicare Part B face, the highest premium bracket is not inflation indexed. So over time, when you guys are seniors, unless something changes, you're going to be facing very high very high taxation on your Medicare benefits in the form of very high premiums that are called premiums, but they're actually taxes. You'll have all of your Social Security benefits, and not all of them, but 85% of them subject to taxation. And then there's other features of the tax system that are not inflation indexed. You have capital gains that are occurring to the extent that we're seeing capital losses in some areas, but if you have a property that appreciates, now you sell it, a lot of that appreciation is just from inflation. It's not due to a real appreciation, but you're going to be taxed on the entire capital gain. So we need to fix the tax system so that we're taxing real asset income, not nominal asset income. We're taxing real Social Security benefits, not nominal ones. We're taxing. We're not hurting older people through inflation on the Medicare premiums. This can be done quickly and easily by the government. But anyway, let me stop there. That was a long answer. I think the government's making money by making money. Basic story.
Yeah, just to Alex's great question, one very important aspect of when will inflation come down and how quickly it will come down is, of course, the very hard question, why did it go up? And this is almost a clash between our economics textbook, where we really have demand and supply as the main things you can move your curves around, and you can find out how much upward pressure is there as a function of how much fiscal policy was done, how much monetary policy was there done. But there's the other way of looking at things, just almost practically looking at the CPI index, which has, of course, a lot of subcomponents. And when you start looking at it from that perspective, then, of course, the CPI index, it becomes very difficult to disentangle. Why did things go up? Was it because of demand, or was it because of supply? Was it because of supply chain problems? Was it because of the situation in Ukraine, the sanctions that came along? All those things make this a challenging statistical exercise. But there is, nevertheless, an effort at the San Francisco Federal Reserve that came out a new paper here a few weeks ago that tried to quantify how much of the increase in inflation since April of 2021 to today was driven by demand. And what that paper finds is that only a third of the rise in inflation was driven by demand, meaning by extraordinary fiscal policy and extraordinary monetary policy. And if that's the case, if 2/3 is supply and other things that was driven by supply chain problems, driven by energy prices going up, well, now that supply chain problems are getting resolved. If you look at the latest data for what it costs to transport a container from China to the US West Coast, at the peak in 2021, the price of transporting a container was about $20,000 for a 40-foot container. Today, that's now down to $7,500, meaning the price of transporting goods has come down, not only on containers, same thing if you look at the transportation cost by truck, also has come down, by rail, and by air has also come down. So that means that now the supply chain problems are getting better. So if that was a very important reason why inflation went up, we should maybe now expect inflation to come down and potentially a little bit faster, now that the supply chain problems are getting better. On top of that, if you look at airline ticket prices, there was also an issue that actually went up also until the daily data here in June began to roll over. So also suggesting that maybe airfares in the CPI will go down over the coming months. Similarly, used car prices, new car prices also went up a lot during the pandemic. That's actually also showing signs of rolling over. And finally, rents, the monthly data from Zumper that measures what's happening to the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. In New York City, that's not been coming down yet. And in Boston, it's not been coming down yet. I don't know quite on the West Coast. Maybe, Alex, you could talk to that.
Oh, definitely not.
But,
no.
Okay, but for the nationwide data, it is actually the case that for June, that came down 2.9%. And that's also, remember, in the CPI index, the biggest component, the biggest weight, what we spend most money on as average households is on housing. That has a weight of around 40%. So that means that if rents do come down nationwide, that also begins to signal that inflation could come down. So as Flemming mentioned, the consensus does expect inflation will come down, and there are some signs it may even come down a little bit faster. But the bottom line is that if the Fed aggressively is raising interest rates into something that might be normalizing on its own, that could also be a very critical part of this debate of will we have a recession? And will it be because the Fed raises rates too much? Will it be because we talk ourselves into spending less? What the exact nature of the path we're going down, of why we get into this equilibrium where we may have a recession, is not quite clear at this stage. It is still very foggy if you look ahead from an economic forecasting perspective, but there are various roads we can walk down, and we should at all given points in time be very much aware of what is it that we are saying and how do we talk ourselves into any of these paths or any of these roads ahead of us.
Yeah. For my just on oil, my understanding from reading is that there's been a dramatic increase in. I think the U.S. is producing like a million more barrels. I don't know whether it's a day or whatever, what the measurement is, but there's been some major oil producer increases in oil production. Also on the wheat side, yes, Ukraine is a large producer of wheat. So is Russia, but Ukraine is not the largest producer of wheat. They're the 8th largest world producer of wheat. The largest is China. The second largest is the U.S. So the U.S. could easily produce dramatically more, wheat. We've produced more wheat in the past, so we could make up for Ukraine just by planting more wheat. And within a few months, maybe 6 months, grain prices, at least wheat prices, would be back to where they would otherwise be. So the supply potential of the world economy is really very significant when it gets into gear.
And what's important, just a small comment, as you know, also the Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases about 1 million barrels a day, and there's about 500 million barrels left in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. So we have more than a whole year at least ahead of us where we can release 1 million barrels a day. And on top of that comes, as you're mentioning, exactly the increased supply, not only from the US, potentially also from OPEC. The Europeans have a little bit separate issue with the gas and oil because they're so dependent on Russia. So they may have a little bit higher risk of having a harder time solving the energy supply problems. But the bottom line, exactly as you're mentioning, is that these things with supply, even of food, are all things that really can get resolved eventually. So this is not like the 1970s or even late 1960s, where inflation and upward pressure, overheating economy continues forever. The supply side does respond. It may take a few more quarters, but that response is certainly in motion. And that's a very important reason also why we should expect inflation to ultimately come down to 2% again. Not only because the Fed wants inflation to be 2%, but also because the economy is responding to all the things that are happening at the moment, in particular, again, these high levels of prices.
Cool. So let me, before we conclude, let me see if Alex or Flemming have any final comments or thoughts or questions before we wrap it up.
Well, I guess one question I had on the food issue, just in terms of climate change and what we're seeing in terms of shocks that might be pushing inflationary prices. I mean, I was just reading about how in India, for example, these massive heat waves over the spring have really decimated wheat production for a huge amount of farmers. And I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the government there has actually stopped farmers from being able to export their wheat at higher prices into the world market. And farmers are pretty upset because now they have to sell to a weaker domestic market. How do you think of that in terms of the current crisis of inflation, or going forward as well?
At least there are some structural issues in the background, such as climate change and inequality and other things that certainly have played and continue to play a very, very important role. And sometimes those things, exactly as you're highlighting, interact with the business cycle. So I always think about that when we economics and in markets talk about things, you always need to think about carefully, what is this topic that's being brought up, not only in what you're mentioning here, but generally speaking, is it something that's a structural issue? The most traditional and slow moving structural issues like demographics. And in most cases, demographics doesn't really matter that much from a day to day for what's happened on CNBC or Bloomberg and what financial markets do. But it does happen sometimes, exactly as you're highlighting now, when the structural underlying issues clash with the cyclical movements of the business cycle around the trend growth developments. And that's exactly what we're seeing at the moment, when you come into a situation when suddenly there is just less supply of food, there is just less supply of energy, and it happens on top of an economy that's actually overheating. Then it does put even more upward pressure on commodity prices, and it did for a long time. Therefore, create significant problems for the central banks and the Federal Reserve, and also the ECB, and of course the Bank of Japan, and central banks around the world have been wrestling really with all these issues that we're debating here. So to your point, I think that the climate change is inflationary, because climate change, it does lower supply in the economy, in particular, of course, in food and commodities, but also more broadly, when we need to restructure and build new infrastructure and reorganize the economy in a way that in many ways require green investment and require investment in renewable energy. Those are things that normally just simmer in the background and should be done. And we all agree that this is exactly what's needed. It just happens sometimes when this happens at points when the economy is, for cyclical reasons, overheating, we do get some magnifying effects exactly on the inflation front. And that's what, looking ahead over the next, not just the next few quarters, the next few years, that's what the risk is, that it will take time to invest in renewable energy. It will take time to do the green transition and the energy transition. And therefore, also, some of these inflationary pressures might be more structural while we wait for those things to get into the new world and a new state that we would like to ultimately get to, where we are more, of course, green and have a transition away from fossil fuels and pollution, and therefore get to a state of the world that looks different from where we were even before the pandemic.
Cool. Flemming, what about you? Some final questions, comments?
No questions, unfortunately. I wish I had some lined up, but I also wish I could go on about the climate change thing. But ongoing supply chain, I think it's really interesting because the used cars prices apexing new car prices was really interesting to me under the pandemic, and it's been a lot of fun seeing. Well, fun is all relative. Seeing car manufacturers recover very quickly from this, because the semiconductor shortage came back very quickly, very strongly to a also recovering car industry, automobile industry. So I feel that as the supply side recovers, we are going to see us return to a 2% inflationary rate, especially with the Fed's support and rate hikes. It just takes time. These things take time.
Yeah, that's
I should have sold
a temporary shock. This is the usual economics joke. What is temporary? I mean, Larry, we had Larry, you know this better than anyone, but Keynes always said in the long run, we're all dead. But okay, if we discuss the short run, how long time will it take before inflation comes down to 2%? That's what we're waiting for in financial markets. That's what the stock market is waiting for, namely having inflation come down more towards 2 instead of these 8-9%. And it just takes time, as we're highlighting here, to get the supply side to respond to everything that's been going on.
Alex?
Yeah, I should have sold my car when I had the chance, clearly.
Yeah. So good. Yeah. And one last thing, it might be that, my sense is that companies probably are overshooting with respect to their price hikes. They probably didn't take price increases for many years because of COVID, and just because they don't, inflation was low, and therefore you don't want to be raising prices on your customers that often. So when you have all of a sudden it looks like inflation's quite high, and you're thinking about, gee, I haven't raised my prices in 2-3 years, and there's a good segment of companies that don't raise their prices except for every 2 or 3 years, then you got to say, well, I've got to raise them enough so not have to raise them again in anticipation of not raising. I don't want to upset my customers, have them move somewhere else. So I'm going to do a one-time increase that takes into account, that's high enough to cover me for the next couple of years. Then you've got everybody, or enough companies, kind of overshooting the price increases that would occur if we were kind of in a situation where we had inflation being at a steady level rather than being very low and then jumping up, and now you have people reacting to it. So we might be observing some overshooting of price adjustments that may again be temporary. So we'll have to see, or it may get into people's psychology that inflation is going to be 8%. These are called adaptive expectations, where people aren't looking forward like we're discussing about these indicators, but they're looking backwards at what's happened over the last 12 months, and they get in their head that we're going to have 8-9% inflation for the long term, and they just act on that. So we have to realize that that's a possibility, that psychology is playing a big role, the way people are thinking, the way they're forming their expectations. And then you've got people piling on because they don't want to be on the wrong side of what happens. So, for example, if you looked at the Wall Street Journal yesterday, I've just gone black again, dark again.
We can still see you, though.
You can still see me, okay.
Yeah.
Well, there's an article by two economists called they're John Greenwood and Steve Hanke, Wall Street Journal op-ed. The title is "The Fed Ignored the Money Supply." So they think the Fed is responsible for everything going on with price increases, and a recession is coming. Not a recession might be coming, it's a recession is coming. You see this kind of article or titles, and these guys don't write the titles of their columns. It's an editor at the journal, because the journal editors, all the editors have control over the titles, but they're choosing titles to make things look bad because, and these guys are writing a column to protect their, is it better for you to look, to say that a recession is not coming, and then it does come and everybody gets hurt, or is it better to say it is coming and then say, well, and it doesn't? I think you're better to be protected in terms of arguing for the downside. If you're a forecaster, if you're a member of the financial press, if you're an economist in this context, and that's unfortunate, because we could well end up talking ourselves into this recession like we did, I think, the last time around, and it led to enormous damage to the lives of real people and to the economy. So let me stop there and say this was a cool first Economics Matters, the podcast. Hope to have you guys back on. Thanks so much for participating. And it's clear, Flemming, you're going to be an outstanding economist like your dad. And Alex, you've obviously digested too much economics in your lifetime. So you're a little bit dangerous too on this score. All right, guys, thanks so much. Let's call it quits. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And to you listeners, come back to the next one.
That's right.